The cold March air bit through their jackets as 16 men gathered at the mine entrance that morning, but none of them knew they were walking into a story that would haunt Kentucky's mountains for decades. Stay with me, because what happened in those tunnels reveals a truth darker than the coal they were digging. The Black Rock mine sat like a wound in the Appalachian hillside, its mouth yawning black against the grey dawn of March 15, 1982. Steam rose from coffee cups as the night shift crew assembled, their headlamps cutting weak beams through the mountain mist. These weren't strangers to danger. Coal mining had claimed fathers and grandfathers before them. But something felt different that morning. "Elevator's been acting up again," muttered Jake Morrison, adjusting his hard hat. At 42, he was the crew's unofficial leader, a man whose calloused hands had worked these tunnels for 18 years. His wife Sarah had kissed him goodbye at 5 a.m., same as always, but she'd held on a second longer than usual. The mine's supervisor, Bill Hendricks, emerged from the office trailer with a clipboard and a grim expression. Company orders were clear. Tunnel 7 needed to be cleared by week's end. The coal seam there was rich, and with the economy struggling, Black Rock mining couldn't afford delays. What Hendricks didn't mention was the memo sitting on his desk, a geological survey warning about unstable rock formations in that exact section. "Listen up," Hendricks called out, his breath visible in the cold air. "Corporate wants Tunnel 7 operational. I know there's been talk about structural issues, but the engineers cleared it yesterday." He avoided eye contact with Morrison, who had filed 3 safety complaints about that tunnel in the past month. Tommy Chen, barely 23 and new to the crew, shifted nervously. His father had died in a mine collapse in West Virginia 5 years earlier, and every descent felt like tempting fate. But jobs were scarce in eastern Kentucky, and his pregnant wife needed the insurance. The elevator cage rattled as it descended into the earth, carrying all 16 men into darkness. Their headlamps created a constellation of light in the shaft, illuminating rough-hewn walls that seemed to press closer with each foot they dropped. At 400 feet below ground, the cage shuddered to a stop. "Tunnel 7's that way," Morrison pointed down a narrow corridor that disappeared into blackness. "Stay together, watch for loose rock, and if you hear anything at all, you get out fast." The men spread out through the tunnel system, their picks and shovels ringing against coal and stone. The air was thick with dust, despite the ventilation system, and more than one miner noticed that the usual hum of the air circulation seemed weaker than normal. What they didn't know was that 3 of the main ventilation fans had been shut down to save on electricity costs. By 10 a.m., they had extracted nearly 2 tons of coal from Tunnel 7. The work was backbreaking, but the seam was rich, exactly what the company needed to meet quarterly projections. Morrison paused to wipe sweat from his forehead, his headlamp illuminating strange stress fractures in the ceiling that hadn't been there the week before. "Hey, Bill," he called to a younger miner working nearby. "You see these cracks up here?" Before Bill could answer, a low rumble echoed through the tunnel. It wasn't the familiar sound of machinery or blasting from other sections. This was deeper, more ominous, the mountain itself groaning under pressure. "Everyone out!" Morrison shouted, but his voice was swallowed by a thunderous crack that split the air like lightning. The ceiling began to buckle. What happened next would be debated for decades. Some said it was a natural collapse, inevitable in such old tunnels. Others whispered about corners cut and safety protocols ignored. But in those terrifying moments, as rock and debris rained down, 16 men found themselves trapped in a tomb of coal and stone. Above ground, the mine's emergency sirens began to wail. Sarah Morrison was hanging laundry when she heard them, and her hands froze on the clothesline. Every miner's wife knew that sound. It meant someone wasn't coming home. The rescue operation began within hours, but something was wrong from the start. Instead of the usual coordinated effort involving state mining officials and federal inspectors, only company personnel were allowed near the site. Families gathered at the mine entrance, but they were kept behind hastily erected barriers, told that rescue efforts were too dangerous for observers. By evening, company officials made a stunning announcement. The tunnel had collapsed completely, making rescue impossible. The 16 men were declared dead, their bodies irretrievable. The mine would be permanently sealed within 48 hours, but Sarah Morrison wasn't buying it. Neither were the other families. Rescue operations for trapped miners typically lasted days, sometimes weeks. Why was BlackRock Mining so eager to seal the tunnel and walk away? As darkness fell over the Kentucky mountains, heavy machinery arrived to begin filling the mine entrance with concrete. The families watched in horror as their last hope of recovering their loved ones was literally being buried before their eyes. "They're covering something up," whispered Mary Chen, Tommy's widow, clutching her pregnant belly. "This isn't about safety. This is about secrets." She was right, but the truth was darker than any of them could imagine. In corporate boardrooms hundreds of miles away, executives were already crafting the official narrative. The BlackRock mine incident would be filed away as an unfortunate but unavoidable industrial accident. The families would receive modest settlements in exchange for their silence. The media would move on to other stories. But secrets have a way of clawing their way to the surface, especially in small mountain communities where everyone knows everyone else's business. And some truths are too big to stay buried, even under tons of concrete and coal. The 16 miners of Tunnel 7 had descended into darkness that March morning, expecting to return home for dinner. Instead, they had walked into a conspiracy that would span decades, involving corporate cover-ups, government complicity, and a community's desperate fight for truth. As the concrete trucks rumbled away from the sealed mine entrance, leaving behind only a metal plaque with 16 names, the real story was just beginning. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is ask the right questions in a town built on keeping the wrong answers buried. 24 hours after the concrete dried over Tunnel 7, BlackRock Mining's official statement hit every newspaper in Kentucky, but the families who read it knew something was terribly wrong. Keep watching, because the lies in that press release would unravel everything the company tried to hide. The Harlan County Courthouse buzzed with unusual activity on March 17, 1982. Reporters from Louisville and Lexington had driven through winding mountain roads to cover what should have been a routine mining accident briefing. But nothing about this felt routine to the families crowding the courthouse steps, clutching copies of the morning paper. "Tragic but unavoidable collapse claims 16 miners," read the headline in the Harlan Daily Enterprise. The article, barely 3 paragraphs long, cited geological instability and unprecedented structural failure as the cause. What it didn't mention were the 3 safety violations BlackRock had received in the past 6 months, or the fact that Tunnel 7 had been flagged as potentially dangerous by state inspectors just 2 weeks earlier. Sarah Morrison sat in the front row of the courthouse meeting room, her hands trembling as she held the newspaper. Next to her, Mary Chen rocked back and forth, her pregnancy now showing at 5 months. Behind them, 14 other families waited for answers that would never come. BlackRock's corporate representative, a thin man in an expensive suit named Richard Caldwell, stepped to the podium with the confidence of someone who had delivered bad news before. His briefcase contained talking points prepared by the company's legal team, each phrase carefully crafted to minimize liability while expressing appropriate sympathy. "Ladies and gentlemen," Caldwell began, his voice echoing in the packed room. "Yesterday's tragic events at the BlackRock mine represent an act of nature that no amount of preparation could have prevented. Our geological surveys indicate that an underground water source shifted unexpectedly, causing catastrophic structural failure in Tunnel 7. Sarah Morrison's hand shot up. "What about the bodies? When can we bury our husbands?" Caldwell's expression didn't change. I'm afraid the collapse was so severe that recovery operations would endanger additional lives. The tunnel is completely sealed by thousands of tons of rock and debris. Our engineers estimate that any attempt at excavation could trigger secondary collapses throughout the mine system. That's not what rescue teams usually do, called out Frank Dobson, whose son Billy had been on the crew. They dig for weeks sometimes. Why are you giving up after one day? The question hung in the air like smoke from a coal fire. Caldwell shuffled his papers, buying time. What he couldn't say was that BlackRock's insurance policy had a clause requiring immediate sealing of catastrophically compromised tunnels to prevent further liability. The company had activated that clause within hours of the collapse. The decision was made in consultation with state mining officials, Caldwell replied. Safety must be our primary concern. But Mary Chen had been asking questions around town, and she'd learned something interesting. Her neighbor worked at the county clerk's office and had seen the paperwork. No state officials had signed off on the sealing. In fact, the state mining inspector who should have overseen the operation had been told his services weren't needed. Which state officials? Mary demanded, standing up despite her pregnancy. Give us names. We want to talk to them ourselves. Caldwell's jaw tightened. I don't have that information with me today, but I assure you that all proper protocols were followed. The lie was so obvious that several family members began shouting questions at once. Why hadn't they been notified before the sealing? Why were no federal inspectors involved? Why was the company so eager to close the case? In the chaos, few people noticed a young man in the back of the room taking notes. David Reeves worked for the Harlan Daily Enterprise, and something about this story didn't add up. He'd covered mining accidents before, and the standard procedure was always the same. Extensive rescue efforts, federal oversight, and detailed investigations that took months to complete. After the meeting dissolved into angry accusations and empty promises, Reeves approached Sarah Morrison in the courthouse parking lot. She was crying, but her tears were mixed with rage. Mrs. Morrison, he said gently, I'm a reporter with the Daily Enterprise. I'd like to ask you some questions about your husband's work at the mine. Sarah wiped her eyes and looked at the young man. He couldn't have been much older than her son, but there was something earnest in his expression that made her trust him. Jake filed safety complaints, she said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. 3 of them in the past month. He said Tunnel 7 was dangerous, that the company was cutting corners to meet production quotas. Reeves felt his pulse quicken. Do you have copies of those complaints? Jake kept everything. They're in a box in our basement. Sarah hesitated, then made a decision that would change everything. Come by tonight after dark, and don't tell anyone where you got them. That evening, as Reeves drove through the winding mountain roads to the Morrison house, he didn't notice the black sedan following him at a distance. The car belonged to a private security firm that BlackRock Mining kept on retainer for sensitive situations. Sarah Morrison handed him a manila folder containing Jake's handwritten safety reports, each one documenting specific hazards in Tunnel 7, loose ceiling supports, inadequate ventilation, and water seepage that weakened the tunnel walls. The most recent report, dated just 5 days before the collapse, warned that catastrophic failure is imminent without immediate structural reinforcement. He tried to get the union involved, Sarah explained, but they said their hands were tied. The company threatened to close the whole mine if workers didn't meet production targets. Reeves photographed each document with his camera, the flash illuminating pages that would have saved 16 lives if anyone in authority had bothered to read them. But as he prepared to leave, Sarah grabbed his arm. Be careful, she whispered. People who ask too many questions around here have a way of disappearing. She was more right than she knew. The next morning, Reeves arrived at the newspaper office to find his editor, Tom Bradley, waiting with a grim expression and a phone message. Corporate called. Bradley said, holding up a slip of paper. "BlackRock's legal team. They're threatening to pull all their advertising if we publish anything that implies negligence or cover-up." For a small-town newspaper, losing BlackRock's advertising meant the difference between staying in business and closing down. The mining company didn't just buy ads. They sponsored the high school football team, the annual county fair, and half the local businesses that also advertised in the paper. "What are you saying?" Reeves asked, though he already knew the answer. "I'm saying the story dies here. We report the official version and move on." But some stories refuse to die, especially when they're built on lies. As Reeves walked out of the newspaper office, the manila folder hidden in his jacket, he made a decision that would haunt him for decades. He was going to find the truth about Tunnel 7, even if it meant risking everything. Because 16 men had died in that mine, and their families deserved better than corporate spin and convenient lies. The official story might satisfy lawyers and insurance companies, but it wouldn't satisfy the people who knew that sometimes the most dangerous thing in a coal mine isn't the coal, it's the people who profit from it. 3 weeks after the official statement, the families of the 16 miners discovered that asking questions in a company town could be more dangerous than working in the mines themselves. What happened to Mary Chen that Tuesday night will show you just how far some people will go to keep the truth buried. The settlement checks arrived on a grey April morning, delivered by registered mail to each of the 16 families. $25,000, enough to cover funeral expenses and a few months of bills, but not nearly enough to replace a lifetime of lost wages. The accompanying letter was brief and to the point. Acceptance of the settlement constituted agreement not to pursue further legal action against BlackRock Mining. Sarah Morrison stared at the check on her kitchen table, her coffee growing cold as she read the fine print. The legal language was dense, but the message was clear. Take the money and stay quiet, or get nothing at all. "It's blood money," she told Mary Chen over the phone. "They're trying to buy our silence." Mary was 7 months pregnant now, her belly round with the child Tommy would never meet. The settlement money would help with medical bills and baby expenses, but it felt like betraying her husband's memory. "What choice do we have?" Mary asked, her voice breaking. "I can't work much longer, and the baby's coming whether I can afford it or not." That afternoon, Sarah Morrison made a decision that would change everything. Instead of cashing the check, she drove to the county courthouse and filed a wrongful death lawsuit against BlackRock Mining. The clerk who processed the paperwork, a woman named Betty Hawkins, tried to warn her. "Mrs. Morrison," Betty whispered, glancing around the empty office, "are you sure about this? The company has ways of making life difficult for people who cause trouble." Sarah's jaw was set with determination. "My husband died because they ignored his safety reports. I won't let them pretend it was just an accident." Word of the lawsuit spread through the mountain community like wildfire. By evening, Sarah's phone was ringing constantly, some calls offering support, others delivering warnings. The most disturbing call came just after midnight. "Drop the lawsuit," a man's voice said, distorted and threatening. "Bad things happen to widows who don't know when to quit." Sarah hung up, her hands shaking. She checked the locks on her doors and windows, then sat in her living room with Jake's hunting rifle across her lap, waiting for dawn. The harassment escalated quickly. Sarah's car tires were slashed twice in 1 week. Her mailbox was destroyed with a baseball bat. Someone threw a rock through her kitchen window with a note attached, "Last warning." But the worst was yet to come. Mary Chen was walking home from her doctor's appointment on a Tuesday evening in late April when a black pickup truck pulled alongside her on the empty mountain road. She was 8 months pregnant now, moving slowly and carefully on the gravel shoulder. "You Mary Chen?" the driver called out. He was a large man with a beard, someone she didn't recognize from town. "Yes," she replied, instinctively placing a protective hand on her belly. "Heard you've been talking to reporters about your dead husband. That true?" Mary's heart began to race. She hadn't spoken to any reporters, but she had been asking questions around town about the mine collapse. "I don't know what you mean," the man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "See, the thing is, accidents happen all the time in these mountains. Pregnant women fall down steep hills. Cars slide off icy roads. Would be a real shame if something happened to you and that baby." The truck's engine revved menacingly as Mary backed away, her breath coming in short gasps. The stress of the encounter triggered early labor pains that sent her to the hospital that night, where doctors managed to stop the contractions but warned her about the dangers of stress during pregnancy. The message was clear: keep quiet or face the consequences. Other families received similar visits. Frank Dobson, whose son Billy had died in the collapse, found his hunting dogs poisoned in their kennels. The Kowalski family's barn burned down under suspicious circumstances. Each incident was reported to the sheriff's department, but Deputy Sheriff Carl Brennan, whose brother worked for BlackRock's security contractor, found no evidence of foul play. The campaign of intimidation was working. One by one, families began cashing their settlement checks and signing the non-disclosure agreements. The financial pressure was too great and the fear too real for most to continue fighting, but Sarah Morrison refused to back down, even when the threats became more specific. "We know where your grandson goes to school," a voice told her during another late-night phone call. "Third grade at Harlan Elementary, right? Walks home alone on Tuesdays when his mama works late." Sarah's blood ran cold. Her daughter-in-law worked as a nurse at the county hospital, and 8-year-old Michael did indeed walk home alone on Tuesdays. The next day, Sarah arranged for Michael to stay with neighbors on those afternoons. But the message was clear: no one was safe from BlackRock's reach. The psychological warfare was sophisticated and effective. The company didn't need to actually harm anyone. The threat was enough to silence most opposition. But they had underestimated the determination of a few key families and the growing suspicions of people who had lived in these mountains long enough to recognize a cover-up when they saw one. David Reeves, the young reporter from the Daily Enterprise, had been quietly investigating despite his editor's warnings. He discovered that several of the accidents befalling the families followed a pattern. They always happened after the victims had been seen talking to outsiders or asking questions about the mine collapse. More importantly, he'd learned that BlackRock Mining had hired Pinnacle Security Services, a firm specializing in corporate crisis management and community relations. In plain English, they were professional intimidators who specialized in silencing whistleblowers and potential litigants. The breakthrough came when Reeves managed to interview a former Pinnacle employee who had quit in disgust after being asked to threaten a pregnant woman. The man, speaking on condition of anonymity, confirmed what everyone suspected. BlackRock was systematically intimidating the families to prevent them from pursuing legal action or talking to investigators. "They call it community outreach," the former employee explained, "but it's really just organized harassment. They have files on every family member, know their routines, their vulnerabilities. It's psychological warfare designed to make people too scared to ask questions." Armed with this information, Reeves began documenting the pattern of intimidation, building a case that would eventually expose not just the mine collapse cover-up, but the systematic campaign to silence its victims. But BlackRock's security team was watching him too, and they had plans for the young reporter who was asking too many questions. Because in a company town where the mine owners controlled everything from the sheriff's department to the newspaper, the most dangerous thing you could be was someone who refused to stay quiet. The families of the 16 miners were learning that in eastern Kentucky, the real danger didn't end when you left the mine. Sometimes it was just beginning. David Reeves thought he was just investigating a mining accident, But what he found in a dusty filing cabinet would expose a conspiracy that reached from the tunnels of Kentucky to the boardrooms of corporate America. Stay with me, because this discovery changes everything we thought we knew about that night in March. The Harlan County Records Office occupied the basement of a building that had seen better decades. Fluorescent lights flickered over rows of metal filing cabinets containing decades of mining permits, safety inspections, and incident reports. David Reeves had been coming here every day for 2 weeks, slowly working his way through boxes of documents that most people never bothered to read. His editor at the Daily Enterprise thought he was wasting time. Tom Bradley had made it clear that the BlackRock story was dead, killed by advertising pressure and legal threats. But Reeves was using his vacation days to continue the investigation, driven by the faces of 16 families who deserve better than corporate lies and convenient silence. "You're looking for mining records again?" asked Clara Hutchins, the elderly clerk who managed the archives. She'd been working in this basement for 30 years and had seen reporters come and go, but none had shown Reeves' persistence. "Yes, ma'am. Anything related to BlackRock mining from the past 5 years." Clara studied him for a moment, then made a decision that would change everything. "There's a box in the back room that might interest you. Files that were supposed to be transferred to state archives but somehow got lost in the shuffle." She led him to a storage room filled with boxes marked for disposal. One container labeled MISC Mining 1977-1982 sat apart from the others. Clara glanced around to make sure they were alone, then opened the box. "These were supposed to be destroyed last month," she whispered, "but I had a feeling someone might need them someday." Inside were dozens of files containing safety inspection reports, geological surveys, and correspondence between BlackRock Mining and state regulatory agencies. Reeves felt his pulse quicken as he began reading the documents. What he found was a paper trail of negligence, cover-ups, and regulatory capture that went back years. The first smoking gun was a geological survey from 1979 that identified Tunnel 7 as structurally unsound and recommended immediate closure. The report, conducted by an independent consulting firm, warned that continued mining in that section could result in catastrophic collapse with potential loss of life. BlackRock's response was a masterclass in corporate manipulation. Instead of closing the tunnel, they hired a different consulting firm, one with financial ties to the mining industry, to conduct a second survey. This report, completed 6 months later, declared Tunnel 7 safe for continued operation with proper monitoring. But the most damning evidence was a series of internal memos between BlackRock executives and state mining officials. The correspondence revealed a systematic pattern of regulatory capture, where state inspectors were either bought off, intimidated, or simply ignored. One memo, dated January 1982, was particularly revealing. Per our discussion, Inspector Williams has agreed to delay his safety review of Tunnel 7 until after Q1 production targets are met. His cooperation in this matter will be reflected in the consulting contract we discussed for his retirement. Inspector Williams was Robert Williams, the state official who should have been overseeing safety at BlackRock's operations. Instead of protecting miners, he was taking bribes to look the other way, while the company violated safety regulations. Another document showed that BlackRock had been falsifying safety reports for years. Gas detection sensors in Tunnel 7 had been disconnected in late 1981 to prevent them from triggering automatic shutdowns when dangerous methane levels were detected. The company simply reported false readings to state regulators, claiming that gas levels were within safe parameters. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was a risk assessment memo from BlackRock's insurance company. The document, dated February 1982, calculated the financial cost of various scenarios, including catastrophic tunnel collapse with multiple fatalities. The insurance company had determined that paying death benefits and legal settlements would be cheaper than implementing proper safety measures. In cold, actuarial language, the memo concluded, "Recommended action. Maintain current safety protocols. Projected liability exposure acceptable within current premium structure." 16 lives had been reduced to a line item in an insurance calculation. Reeves photographed every document, his hands shaking with anger and excitement. This wasn't just evidence of negligence, it was proof of premeditated corporate murder. BlackRock Mining had known that Tunnel 7 was a death trap, and they had sent 16 men into it anyway because the math worked in their favor. But as he prepared to leave the records office, Clara Hutchins grabbed his arm. "Be careful with those," she warned. "People have died for less in these mountains, and whatever you do, don't let them know where you got them." Her warning proved prophetic. That evening, as Reeves worked in his apartment organizing the documents, he noticed a car parked across the street with 2 men inside. The same car had been there when he left for work that morning, and it was still there when he returned. His phone rang just after midnight. "Mr. Reeves," a calm voice said, "you've been asking a lot of questions lately, questions that might be dangerous for your health." "Who is this?" "A friend. Someone who wants to help you understand that some stories are better left untold. You're a young man with a promising career. It would be a shame if something happened to derail that future." The line went dead, but the message was clear. BlackRock's security team knew about his investigation and was prepared to stop it. The next morning, Reeves arrived at the Daily Enterprise to find his editor waiting with a termination letter. Tom Bradley looked genuinely sorry as he handed over the paperwork. "I'm sorry, David. Corporate called again. They know about your investigation, and they're threatening to sue the paper for harassment and defamation. I can't risk it." "Tom, you need to see what I found. They knew the tunnel was going to collapse. They sent those men to die because it was cheaper than fixing the problem." Bradley held up his hand. "I don't want to know. Clean out your desk and turn in your press credentials. And David, whatever you think you've discovered, let it go. Some fights you can't win." But Reeves had no intention of letting it go. As he packed his belongings, he made copies of the most damning documents and hid them in his car. If the local newspaper wouldn't tell the story, he'd find someone who would. That afternoon, he drove to Louisville to meet with reporters from the Courier-Journal, Kentucky's largest newspaper. But when he arrived at their offices, he was told that the reporters he'd spoken to by phone were unavailable and that the paper wasn't interested in unsubstantiated allegations against local businesses. BlackRock's influence reached further than he'd imagined. Frustrated but not defeated, Reeves decided to take a different approach. If he couldn't get the story published in Kentucky, he'd try national media. But first, he needed more evidence. Something so compelling that no amount of corporate pressure could suppress it. The answer came from an unexpected source: Jake Morrison's safety reports, which Sarah Morrison had shown him weeks earlier. Cross-referencing those reports with the documents from the county archives, Reeves discovered something that made his blood run cold. BlackRock Mining hadn't just ignored the safety warnings, they had actively suppressed them. Jake Morrison's reports had been forwarded to state regulators, but someone had intercepted them before they reached the appropriate officials. The reports had been buried in a bureaucratic maze designed to prevent accountability. More importantly, Reeves found evidence that other miners at other BlackRock facilities had filed similar warnings, and that several accidents over the past decade followed the same pattern. Safety complaints, regulatory interference, and convenient collapses that eliminated both the evidence and the witnesses. Tunnel 7 wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a systematic pattern of corporate murder that had been going on for years. Armed with this evidence, Reeves prepared to take his story to the national media. But BlackRock's security team was preparing too, and they had no intention of letting a small-town reporter destroy their carefully constructed cover-up. The war for the truth about Tunnel 7 was about to escalate, and David Reeves was about to learn that in corporate America, the most dangerous thing you can have is evidence. The blueprints David Reeves found hidden in a retired engineer's garage would reveal that Tunnel 7 wasn't just dangerous, it was never supposed to exist at all. What you're about to discover will show you how corporate greed literally carved a path to disaster beneath the Kentucky mountains. Harold Brennan had worked as a mining engineer for 37 years before retiring in 1981, just months before the Tunnel 7 collapse. He lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of Harlan, tending a vegetable garden and trying to forget the compromises he'd made during his career. When David Reeves knocked on his door on a rainy Thursday morning, Brennan almost didn't answer. "I know who you are," the old man said through the screen door. "You're the reporter asking questions about BlackRock. People are saying you're stirring up trouble." "I'm trying to find the truth about what happened to those 16 miners," Reeves replied. "I think you might be able to help." Brennan studied the young man for a long moment, then opened the door. "Come in. But understand, if anyone asks, we never had this conversation." The engineer's living room was sparse but neat, with technical manuals stacked on every available surface. Brennan poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from Reeves, his weathered hands wrapped around the warm mug. "I designed the original layout for the BlackRock mine back in 1965, he began. "Tunnel 7 wasn't part of that design. It was never supposed to be dug." Reeves felt his pulse quicken. "What do you mean?" The geological surveys from the 1960s clearly showed that the area where Tunnel 7 was eventually carved was unstable. Underground water table, soft shale formations, natural gas pockets. It was a disaster waiting to happen. Any competent engineer would have marked it off limits. Brennan stood and walked to a closet, returning with a cardboard box filled with blueprints and technical documents. He spread the original mine schematics across his coffee table, pointing to a section marked with red X's. "See these markings? That's the area where Tunnel 7 was eventually dug. I specifically designated it as no excavation zone because of geological instability. The coal seam there was rich, but accessing it would have required extensive reinforcement that would have made mining economically unfeasible." "So how did Tunnel 7 get built?" Brennan's expression darkened. "Corporate pressure. In 1978, BlackRock's parent company, Consolidated Energy, was facing financial difficulties. Coal prices were high, and they needed to increase production to meet debt obligations. They brought in a new management team with orders to maximize extraction, regardless of safety concerns. The engineer pulled out another set of blueprints, these ones dated 1979. The red X's marking the dangerous area had been removed, replaced with detailed excavation plans for what would become Tunnel 7. They hired a consulting firm called Apex Engineering to redesign the mine layout. Apex had a reputation for cutting corners and ignoring safety protocols in exchange for higher profits. Their engineers either didn't understand the geological risks or chose to ignore them. Reeves studied the blueprints, noting the stark differences between Brennan's conservative original design and Apex's aggressive revision. "Did you try to stop them?" "I tried. I wrote memos, filed reports, even threatened to quit, but Consolidated Energy had invested too much money to back down. They told me to either approve the new design or find another job." Brennan walked to his kitchen window, staring out at the mountains that had defined his entire career. "I should have quit, should have gone public with what I knew, but I was 58 years old with a pension to protect and a sick wife who needed medical insurance. So I signed off on the design and told myself that maybe the new reinforcement techniques would be enough." The engineer returned to the table and pulled out a thick folder marked Tunnel 7 Safety Concerns. "Hey, Inside were dozens of memos, inspection reports and technical assessments documenting the problems that had plagued the tunnel from the moment excavation began. The trouble started immediately, Brennan explained. Water seepage, unstable ceiling supports, methane gas accumulation. Everything I'd predicted came true. But instead of shutting down the tunnel, BlackRock kept pushing deeper, chasing that rich coal seam. One document particularly caught Reeves's attention. A memo from Brennan to BlackRock management dated September 1981, 6 months before the collapse. The engineer had warned that continued excavation in Tunnel 7 without major structural reinforcement will result in catastrophic failure within 6 to 12 months. They ignored it, Brennan said bitterly. Told me I was being overly cautious. Said the new support beams would be sufficient. But the support beams were another cost-cutting measure. Instead of the steel reinforcements Brennan had specified, BlackRock used cheaper wooden supports that were inadequate for the geological conditions in Tunnel 7. The company saved approximately $200,000 in construction costs, money that would have kept 16 men alive. Reeves found another damning document, a cost-benefit analysis prepared by BlackRock's accounting department in late 1981. The analysis calculated that installing proper steel supports in Tunnel 7 would cost $300,000 and reduce quarterly profits by 8%. The document recommended continuing with wooden supports and accepting elevated risk levels as an acceptable business cost. They knew exactly what they were doing, Brennan said, his voice heavy with guilt. They ran the numbers and decided that potential lawsuits and death benefits would be cheaper than proper safety measures. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. Brennan pulled out a folder marked "Confidential" and handed it to Reeves. Inside were internal communications between BlackRock executives and officials from the Mine Safety and Health Administration, MSHA, the federal agency responsible for mining safety. The documents revealed that MSHA had conducted a surprise inspection of Tunnel 7 in January 1982 and found numerous safety violations. The inspector, a man named Robert Chen, had recommended immediate closure of the tunnel pending major safety improvements. But Chen's report had been buried through a combination of political pressure and financial incentives. BlackRock's parent company had significant political connections in Washington, and they used those connections to have Chen transferred to a different region before his report could be acted upon. They moved him to Alaska, Brennan explained. Told him it was a promotion, but everyone knew it was punishment for being too thorough in his inspections. The cover-up went all the way to the top. Consolidated Energy had donated heavily to the political campaigns of several congressmen who sat on committees overseeing mining regulation. When those politicians received calls from company executives expressing concern about overzealous federal inspectors, the message was clear: back off or face reduced campaign contributions. Reeves felt sick as he read through the documents. The Tunnel 7 collapse wasn't just corporate negligence. It was the result of a systematic corruption of the entire regulatory system designed to protect miners. "Why are you showing me this now?" Reeves asked. Brennan was quiet for a long moment, staring at the blueprints spread across his table. "Because I'm dying," he said finally. "Lung cancer from 37 years of breathing coal dust. I've got maybe 6 months left, and I can't take this secret to my grave." The old engineer stood and walked to his garage, returning with a metal filing cabinet. "Everything's in here. Original blueprints, safety reports, correspondence with federal regulators, financial documents showing the bribes and political contributions. It's all the evidence you need to prove that Tunnel 7 was a death trap from the day they started digging." As Reeves loaded the documents into his car, Brennan grabbed his arm. "Be careful. These people have killed 16 men to protect their profits. They won't hesitate to kill one more to protect their secrets." That evening, as Reeves organized the evidence in his apartment, he realized he now had enough documentation to expose not just the Tunnel 7 cover-up, but an entire system of corruption that stretched from the coal mines of Kentucky to the halls of Congress. But he also knew that BlackRock's security team was watching him, and that possessing this evidence had made him a target. The question wasn't whether they would try to stop him. It was whether he could get the story out before they succeeded. Because in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, the most dangerous thing you could have wasn't black lung disease or a mine collapse. It was the truth. The morning David Reeves was supposed to meet with federal investigators, his car exploded in his driveway, and the mountain community learned that some truths are too dangerous to tell. Watch until the end, because what happened next shows how fear can bury evidence deeper than any mine collapse. The call came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in late May. Sarah Morrison was feeding her chickens when her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, ran across the yard with tears streaming down her face. "Sarah, you need to turn on the radio. Something terrible has happened." The news report was brief but devastating. Local reporter David Reeves was killed early this morning when his vehicle exploded outside his apartment complex. Police are investigating the incident as a possible gas leak, though some witnesses reported seeing suspicious individuals in the area prior to the explosion. Sarah sank into her kitchen chair, her hands shaking as she absorbed the news. Reeves had called her just 2 days earlier, excited about evidence he'd gathered that would blow the whole thing wide open. He'd been scheduled to meet with federal investigators from the FBI's Public Corruption Unit that very afternoon. Now he was dead, and with him died the best hope of exposing the truth about Tunnel 7. The official investigation into Reeves's death was perfunctory at best. Sheriff's Deputy Carl Brennan, whose brother worked for BlackRock's security contractor, concluded within hours that the explosion was caused by a faulty fuel line. No forensic experts were called in, no federal investigators were notified, and the scene was cleaned up with suspicious speed. But Mary Chen, now a mother to a 3-month-old son she'd named Tommy after his father, wasn't buying the official story. She'd been in contact with Reeves regularly, and she knew he'd been receiving death threats. More importantly, she'd seen the black sedan that had been following him around town for weeks. "They killed him," she told Sarah during a hushed conversation at the grocery store. "Just like they killed our husbands, and they're going to get away with it unless we do something." But doing something had become increasingly dangerous. In the weeks following Reeves's death, the campaign of intimidation against the miners' families intensified dramatically. Frank Dobson found his truck's brake lines cut. The Kowalski family's teenage daughter was followed home from school by men in unmarked vehicles. Even elderly relatives weren't safe. Sarah Morrison's mother received threatening phone calls, warning her to control her daughter before something bad happens. The psychological warfare was sophisticated and effective. BlackRock's security team, led by a former military intelligence officer named Marcus Webb, had studied counterinsurgency tactics used in foreign conflicts and adapted them for domestic use. Their goal wasn't just to silence the families, it was to terrorize the entire community into compliance. Webb's team compiled detailed dossiers on every family member, mapping their daily routines, identifying their vulnerabilities, and developing specific pressure points for each individual. They knew which families had children in school, which had elderly relatives in nursing homes, and which were struggling financially. The campaign worked with ruthless efficiency. One by one, families began withdrawing their support for any investigation into the mine collapse. Some moved away from the area entirely, relocating to distant cities where BlackRock's influence couldn't reach them. Others simply retreated into silence, too frightened to speak even among themselves. The local union, which should have been advocating for the dead miners' families, was systematically dismantled through a combination of legal challenges and economic pressure. Union leaders found themselves facing trumped-up criminal charges or sudden financial audits that tied up their resources in legal battles. The Union Hall was vandalized repeatedly until it became too expensive to maintain. Even the churches weren't safe. Reverend Michael Foster, who had spoken out about corporate responsibility during Sunday services, found his congregation dwindling as BlackRock employees were pressured to attend services elsewhere. When he persisted in his criticism, the church's mortgage was mysteriously called in early, forcing the congregation to choose between their pastor and their building. The most effective weapon in BlackRock's arsenal was economic pressure. The mining company was the largest employer in the region, and they made it clear that anyone who supported the family's quest for truth would find themselves unemployed. Small businesses that served the mining community were told to choose sides, support BlackRock's version of events, or lose their contracts. Local newspaper editor Tom Bradley, who had already fired David Reeves under corporate pressure, received a visit from BlackRock executives that made the stakes crystal clear. They didn't threaten him directly. They didn't need to. They simply mentioned that the Daily Enterprise's printing contract with the mining company was up for renewal, and that they'd been considering switching to a more business-friendly publication. The message was received. From that point forward, the Daily Enterprise published only positive stories about BlackRock mining, focusing on their economic contributions to the community while avoiding any mention of safety concerns or the Tunnel 7 incident. But the most devastating blow came when Harold Brennan, the retired engineer who had provided Reeves with crucial evidence, suffered a fatal heart attack just days after the reporter's death. His garage, which had contained decades of mining documents and safety reports, was cleaned out by family members who turned out to be BlackRock security personnel with forged authorization papers. With Brennan dead and his evidence destroyed, the paper trail linking BlackRock to the Tunnel 7 disaster largely disappeared. The few documents that survived were scattered among family members who were too frightened to come forward. Sarah Morrison, who had been the most vocal critic of the company's handling of the incident, found herself completely isolated. Her wrongful death lawsuit was dismissed on technical grounds after her lawyer, citing personal safety concerns, withdrew from the case. No other attorney in the region would take on BlackRock mining, and lawyers from outside the area were warned away through professional channels. The final nail in the coffin came when the federal investigators, who were supposed to meet with Reeves, received orders from Washington to close their inquiry. The directive came from high levels within the Justice Department, influenced by the same political connections that had protected BlackRock for years. By the summer of 1982, just 4 months after the Tunnel 7 collapse, the case was effectively closed. The families had been silenced through a combination of fear, financial pressure, and systematic intimidation. The evidence had been destroyed or buried. The witnesses had been eliminated or terrorized into silence. Mary Chen made the final surrender on a hot July afternoon, signing the non-disclosure agreement that BlackRock had been pressuring her to accept for months. With a baby to feed and no other source of income, she had no choice but to take the settlement money and promise never to speak publicly about her husband's death. "I'm sorry, Tommy," she whispered to her infant son as she signed the papers. "I tried to get justice for your daddy, but they're too powerful. Maybe someday, when you're older, you can finish what we started." As the summer of 1982 faded into autumn, the mountains of eastern Kentucky returned to their usual quiet. The BlackRock mine resumed full operations with new safety protocols that were more about public relations than actual protection. Tunnel 7 remained sealed, its secrets buried under tons of concrete and the weight of corporate power. The 16 miners who had died that March morning were remembered only on a small memorial plaque that BlackRock erected near the mine entrance, a gesture that cost the company less than $500 and generated positive publicity about their commitment to worker safety. But in the hollows and ridges of the Appalachian Mountains, some people remembered. They remembered the questions that had been asked and the answers that had been silenced. They remembered the young reporter who had died for asking too many questions, and the families who had been terrorized into submission. And they waited, knowing that someday, somehow, the truth about Tunnel 7 would find its way to the surface. Because in the mountains of Kentucky, secrets have a way of outlasting the people who try to bury them. 40 years later, a construction crew breaking ground for a new shopping center made a discovery that would finally vindicate the families who never stopped believing their loved ones deserved justice. What they found beneath the Kentucky soil proves that some truths refuse to stay buried forever. The bulldozer operator thought he'd hit a water main when the ground gave way beneath his machine on that crisp October morning in 2022. Marcus Williams had been working construction in Harlan County for 15 years, but he'd never seen anything like the cavern that opened up in front of him. A perfectly preserved section of mining tunnel that wasn't supposed to exist. "Shut it down!" called site supervisor Janet Morrison, Sarah Morrison's granddaughter, who had taken her grandmother's maiden name and returned to Kentucky after law school. She'd been overseeing the construction project as part of her work with a Louisville development firm, never imagining that her family's past would literally surface beneath her feet. The tunnel was part of the old Blackrock mine system, sealed for 4 decades, but remarkably intact. As emergency crews secured the area and mining engineers were called in to assess the situation, Janet noticed something that made her blood run cold. Personal belongings scattered throughout the tunnel, including a lunchbox with J. Morrison scratched into the metal, her grandfather's lunchbox, the one he'd carried into Tunnel 7 on March 15, 1982, and never brought home. Within hours, the discovery had attracted attention from state mining officials, federal investigators, and reporters from across the region. The tunnel system was far more extensive than Blackrock's official records had indicated, with multiple chambers and connecting passages that suggested illegal excavation beyond permitted boundaries. But the most shocking discovery was yet to come. Dr. Amanda Foster, a forensic anthropologist from the University of Kentucky, was called in to examine what appeared to be human remains in one of the tunnel chambers. What she found challenged everything the public had been told about the Tunnel 7 collapse. "These aren't the remains of men killed in a sudden cave-in," Dr. Foster explained to the assembled investigators. The positioning of the bodies, the lack of crushing injuries, the presence of makeshift barriers, this suggests the miners survived the initial collapse and were trapped alive for an extended period. The evidence painted a horrifying picture. The 16 miners hadn't died instantly in a catastrophic collapse, as Blackrock had claimed. They had survived in a pocket of the tunnel system, probably for days or even weeks, before succumbing to dehydration, starvation, or carbon monoxide poisoning from the sealed environment. More damning still were the messages carved into the tunnel walls. Desperate pleas for help, final words to loved ones, and detailed accounts of what had really happened that March morning. Jake Morrison had used a piece of metal to scratch his final testimony into the stone. Company knew tunnel was bad. "I told us to work anyway. Ceiling came down, but we're alive in back section. Air getting bad. If anyone finds this, tell Sarah I love her. Tell them all we tried to get out. Blackrock sealed us in. They knew we were alive." The discovery sent shockwaves through Kentucky and beyond. Federal investigators reopened the case, this time with the full resources of the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. The evidence that David Reeves had died trying to expose was finally seeing the light of day, corroborated by the miner's own words carved in stone. Janet Morrison, now armed with her law degree and her family's 40-year quest for justice, filed a new wrongful death lawsuit against Blackrock Mining's successor companies. But this time, she had something her grandmother never had: irrefutable physical evidence and a changed political climate that was less tolerant of corporate cover-ups. The investigation revealed that BlackRock executives had known the miners were alive in the sealed section of the tunnel. Company records, finally subpoenaed after decades of legal protection, showed that rescue equipment had been moved to the site but never deployed. The decision to seal the tunnel permanently had been made not for safety reasons, but to prevent the miners from testifying about the safety violations that had caused the collapse. Mary Chen, now 63 and living in Ohio, returned to Kentucky for the first time in decades when news of the discovery broke. Her son Tommy, named for the father he never knew, was now a successful engineer who had spent his career working to improve mining safety standards. My mother never stopped believing that the truth would come out. Tommy told reporters gathered at the memorial service held for the 16 miners whose remains had finally been recovered. She died 5 years ago, but she always said that my father and his friends were still down there, waiting for someone to find them and tell their story. The federal investigation ultimately resulted in criminal charges against several former BlackRock executives, though many of the key figures had died in the intervening decades. More importantly, it led to comprehensive reforms in mining safety regulations and oversight procedures designed to prevent similar cover-ups. Harold Brennan's nephew, who had inherited the engineer's personal papers, came forward with documents that had been hidden in a safety deposit box for 40 years. The papers included detailed evidence of the regulatory corruption that had enabled the Tunnel 7 disaster, leading to additional investigations and prosecutions. The families of the 16 miners finally received the justice they had sought for 4 decades. A federal jury awarded them $50 million in damages, but more importantly, they received official acknowledgement that their loved ones had been murdered by corporate greed and government complicity. Sarah Morrison had died in 2018, just 4 years before the truth was finally revealed, but her granddaughter Janet ensured that her grandmother's fight hadn't been in vain. The Sarah Morrison Mining Safety Foundation, established with proceeds from the lawsuit settlement, now works to protect miners' rights and prevent corporate cover-ups. The BlackRock mine site was designated as a memorial park, with a museum documenting not just the Tunnel 7 disaster, but the broader history of mining safety struggles in Appalachia. The original memorial plaque, with its sanitized corporate language, was replaced with a new monument bearing the miners' own words and a commitment to never forget the price of putting profits before people. But perhaps the most fitting memorial was the change in federal law that resulted from the case. The Tunnel 7 Act requires immediate federal oversight of any mining accident involving fatalities, prevents companies from sealing accident sites without independent investigation, and establishes severe criminal penalties for executives who knowingly endanger workers' lives. David Reeves was posthumously awarded the Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting, based on the notes and documents found in his apartment after his death. His story, finally told through the evidence he had died trying to expose, became a landmark case study in corporate accountability and the importance of investigative journalism. The black sedan that had followed Reeves in his final weeks was traced to Pinnacle Security Services, the firm that had orchestrated the intimidation campaign against the miners' families. Several former employees came forward with testimony about the systematic harassment, leading to federal racketeering charges against the company's leadership. Marcus Webb, the former military intelligence officer who had led BlackRock's security operations, was found guilty of conspiracy and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. During his trial, prosecutors revealed the full scope of the intimidation campaign, including evidence that Webb's team had been responsible for David Reeves's death, a car bombing disguised as an accident. The mountain community that had been terrorized into silence for 40 years finally found its voice. Former BlackRock employees came forward with stories of safety violations, regulatory corruption, and corporate intimidation that painted a picture of systematic abuse spanning decades. Tom Bradley, the newspaper editor who had fired Reeves under corporate pressure, published a final editorial before retiring, acknowledging his role in suppressing the truth and apologizing to the families who had been denied justice for so long. "I was a coward," Bradley wrote. "I chose financial security over journalistic integrity, and 16 families paid the price for my weakness. I cannot undo the harm I caused, but I can ensure that this story is finally told in full." The Harlan Daily Enterprise, under new ownership, published a comprehensive investigation into the Tunnel 7 cover-up, winning multiple journalism awards and helping to restore public trust in local media. But the most powerful testimony came from the miners themselves, through the messages they had carved into the tunnel walls during their final days. Their words, preserved in stone, provided a minute-by-minute account of their ordeal and their growing realization that they had been abandoned by the company they had served faithfully. "Day 3, read one message carved by Tommy Chen. "Still no rescue. Air getting worse. Company trucks outside but no one digging. Think they want us to die. Baby coming soon. Tell Mary I love her." The discovery of these messages transformed the Tunnel 7 case from a story about corporate negligence into a story about corporate murder. The miners hadn't just died in an accident. They had been deliberately left to die to protect BlackRock's secrets. As the 40th anniversary of the Tunnel 7 collapse approached in March 2022, the site had become a pilgrimage destination for mining families from across Appalachia. The Memorial Park drew thousands of visitors each year, serving as both a tribute to the 16 miners and a warning about the dangers of unchecked corporate power. Janet Morrison, now a successful civil rights attorney specializing in corporate accountability cases, often brought her own children to visit their great-grandfather's memorial. She would tell them the story of how their family had fought for justice across 4 decades, never giving up hope that the truth would eventually surface. "Your great-grandmother Sarah used to say that the mountains remember everything," Janet would tell them. She was right. The truth was buried for 40 years, but it was always there, waiting for the right moment to come to light. The Tunnel 7 case became a turning point in American mining safety, leading to the most comprehensive reforms in industry history. But more importantly, it demonstrated that corporate power, no matter how vast, cannot permanently suppress the truth when ordinary people refuse to give up the fight for justice. The 16 miners who descended into Tunnel 7 on that cold March morning in 1982 had expected to return home for dinner. Instead, they became symbols of the ongoing struggle between corporate greed and human dignity. Their story, finally told in full, serves as a reminder that in America, justice may be delayed, but it cannot be denied forever. In the mountains of eastern Kentucky, where coal dust still settles on windowsills and mining families still worry about their loved ones' safety, the memorial to the Tunnel 7 miners stands as both a tribute to the past and a promise for the future. The inscription on the monument, taken from Jake Morrison's final message, captures the essence of their legacy. "We died not from the mountain's fury, but from men's greed. Let our story be told so that others might live." And finally, after 40 years of silence, their story has been told.